What did you learn about the Republic and its attitude to Northern Ireland in your time inside the Seanad?
There's a serious lack of understanding between Belfast and Dublin. We live in a bubble that is 6 counties. They live in a bubble that is 26 counties. And as a consequence of the last 100 years, and I suppose since the recent troubles, we've grown apart separately and differently. So huge lack of understanding. I interestingly didn't know where Leinster House was. I had to Google that. That's an indication of something that's probably only about 85 miles down the road from me, that I didn't know where it was, the seat of government. I was always told that Leinster House and Dublin was a cold place for unionists, that it wasn't a friendly place. So it was with a bit of trepidation I ran for that Senate or Seanad election. And actually, when I went up and started to meet TDs and senators, the interesting thing I think I found was that actually that wasn't the case. It was a very warm place, no issue, no animosity. Lots of people I could differ with politically, but huge respect for each other. And actually, it was very much not a cold house for unionism. So I suppose that was the first thing. And then the second thing was just about the lack of understanding, because lots of people have lived their lives in Dublin in the political arena for many years, knowing that Northern Ireland's that 6 county piece up at the top, but not really understanding it or the people. And the one thing I think was brought home to me at the start of the Seanad was that when I spoke in the Seanad, I always had 2 audiences. So I had very much a northern audience who were watching to see what I was saying, and a southern audience. So anyone from Northern Ireland will know that the nuance, the subtleties, the choice of language and words are critical. You know, it can be used very often against you and say, oh, well, you said this or you said that. So I was very conscious that I had to choose my words carefully every time I spoke in the Seanad, but certainly lack of understanding between Belfast and Dublin was probably the most starting thing. When it was first mooted that I was going to run for a Senate or a Seanad by-election, because even the very name causes a bit of contention, because Seanad is the Irish word, Senate's the anglicised word, the English version. Actually, the interesting thing, I suppose, in Dublin is there's not the same sensitivities around that. So when I looked at my own unionist Protestant community here, a bit of intrepidation, a bit of misunderstanding, or a bit of intrigue, but why on earth would you stand for this? What would you want to be in a Dublin government for? What's the purpose of that? Why on earth do you think it's sensible? The unionist community locally, I suppose, couldn't really understand what the rationale would be or why you'd ever want to do that. I think now people recognise that there's huge value. There's certainly more value in us being in the middle of a conversation than being outside a conversation. I'm always very critical of the fact that you always risk a conversation in an echo chamber without the opposing perspective on some of these conversations. I had a meeting actually with a couple of people actually from the Judith Thompson's department. Were down in Dublin with me for a meeting one day. It was an interesting conversation because we happened to come on the legacy conversation. And I remember saying to them at that meeting, I said, look guys, you know, it's interesting because in the conversations I have in Dublin, you know, there's sometimes this thing about legacy, and legacy is a thing that Northern Irish people will need to deal with. And what I actually saw was actually 22 years from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. I think actually in Northern Ireland, we are on a journey of dealing with legacy now. We're not certainly near there. But my point is this, Henry, that I actually see legacy as something that's an all-island issue. Because what I did see in Dublin when I went down there at the beginning of this process was that the vitriol and animosity and antagonism with Sinn Féin and the other parties was startling. And I always assumed that was a Northern Irish phenomenon, where this gulf between political unionism and Sinn Féin, because of our recent past, was something that wouldn't be replicated anywhere else. Interestingly, there seemed to be more vitriol and hatred south of the border with Sinn Féin and the old Civil War parties of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael. When you look back at this rich tapestry of history we have across the island, and people, you know, we're at a very important moment now, which is a centenary, marking of a centenary of Northern Ireland. And when we look at the history and that tapestry of interaction between London, Dublin and Belfast, between unionists, nationalists, loyalists and Republicans, it's so complicated and so confusing that you've got to be careful, because you've got to look at every component of that in context. And I think that when I looked at what happened with the RIC commemoration, it was something that we have to contend with in Northern Ireland all the time. We've had to contend with it because, you know, very often the ghosts of people that the Irish Times referred to are long but gone. And for Northern Irish people, some of the ghosts actually are still alive and kicking, and some of the legacy issues we have are very much real and tangible for people. And even though those events around 1916 to 1921 are very, very emotive, the south of the border, all those people have gone. So this is about history. It's about archive. It's about folklore, sometimes about myth and narratives that have been passed down generations. So what I saw with the RIC commemorations was that actually a legacy conversation is a conversation that everyone needs to engage with, because I think there are unresolved issues south of the border. You can be sometimes a bit slightly condescending and patronising that it's Northern Ireland needs to deal with legacy. I think we all have a responsibility to deal with legacy, and because this is about respect. And we also need to reconcile the fact that there was no one side right or wrong in this. So, and I think that that's a really important point. If we're going to move forward, I've got to accept that there's a narrative that I didn't grow up with, that wasn't my narrative and wasn't my recollection of history, but I have to respect that, and others have to do the same with me. The Good Friday Agreement's founded on a line which is mutual respect and parity of esteem. So the first thing we've got to have when we look at a shared island is mutual respect. So for me, that's to say there are others want Irish unity. I don't think Irish unity is appropriate at the moment. I think that we need a conversation, but you can't assume that the end or the conclusion of the conversation is Irish unity. So we need to have mutual respect that conversation might culminate in the point, or might come to a point where it says actually Northern Ireland is part of the UK, Republic of Ireland is a 26 county republic, working together better is the way forward. For anyone who fundamentally disagrees with partition in Ireland, which remember was the forced separation of land and people, well then if you fundamentally disagree with that, you can't agree or subscribe to the forced unification of land and people. So it has to be a journey, it has to be a conversation, it has to be dialogue. But I always think that the secret of this is about two things. Firstly, as I said, respect. And secondly, it's an open mind. Because if you go into this conversation with a closed mind and assuming that you know the outcome, it's how you get there, then I think you're destined to fail. But if you have an open mind and inclusivity and respect for the other perspective, then certainly the shared island conversation is one that's worthy of having. I think that's not actually the most important. I think the most important thing for us all at the moment, Henry, is about uniting people. And I think that's a work in progress. And I think until we strip away the labels and we get inside the minds of the people behind the labels. And it was brought home to me, because I had a meeting in East Belfast with a group of loyalists. And one of the loyalists, very, very well-renowned, very well-known loyalists, said to me, look, Ian, I'm not proud of what I did in the 70s, but you have to understand, in the 70s, this was the only course of action I had. I didn't see another course of action. And you can't judge my actions in 1970 through the lens of 2020. And I think it was a really important statement, because he was right. And he was right on all sides of this conflict. And I might not agree with other people's perspective. I might not agree with other people's politics, but I have to respect it. I have to understand it and respect it. And that doesn't mean I agree with it or subscribe to it, but I have to respect it. And what I expect in return is respect from my politics. I think it's a good project. I think, Henry, to be honest, the problem we've had is that the perception of what unionism is like is very skewed. It's distorted. It's seen through a very, very narrow lens. What I see time and time again is that the people who are perceived as being narrow, regressive, sectarian, bigoted, conservative are actually very much an outgoing, positive, inclusive bunch of people who are forward-looking, who are not hung up on the past. So I think there's a key role we've got to do here, and that's why Pete's work is so important. It's about communication. It's about telling people we're actually good people. It's about telling people that this narrative that's sometimes spun about disadvantage, inequality, unfairness, sectarianism, it's not here in Northern Ireland. We've moved on. And I think sometimes there's others could, if they knew the truth of what's going on here, there's lots of good things going on, But fundamentally, I've said, and I always go to this point, and I'll leave you with this one, the best thing that we export, the best thing that we produce in Northern Ireland is good people.